Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest is no stranger to the world of Canadian football from the perspective of a media member. He was inducted into Canadian Football Hall of Fame, the media wing, in 2012. As well, he is a reporter and editor for the Canadian Press and the National Football Reporter, Dan Ralph. Dan, I'm really glad to be able to finally sit down and chat with you more, as I know that you are someone who loves Canadian football, loves football in general, and has a thing or two for knowing about a bit about horse racing and stuff in that realm.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So the Canadian Draft is upon us, and every single year I always see that little clip from the Simpsons episode about the Canadian Football League draft, which makes you know when the CFL is sharing it that it's coming about. You were at the National Combine, actually, where we first had the chance to meet. Mm-hmm. And there are some interesting storylines heading into the draft next week on May 3rd. My first question for you is, where do you think Trey Ford ends up going in the draft?
Well, it's interesting. I think, he comes in as the highest rated quarterback, Canadian quarterback that I've ever seen in the draft. In the Central Scouting or the CFL Scouting Bureau, he's listed in the top 10, which is unheard of for a Canadian college quarterback. I think it all depends on where he goes, if he goes in the National Football League as a priority free agent or a late pick. And I think if he does get an NFL shot, it will be as a priority free agent. And if a team takes him knowing that he's not going to be there for a while in the Canadian draft, it may impact where he's taken. Right now, the record for a Canadian taken in the Canadian Football League draft is 15th overall, which would be in the second round. Both Nathan Rourke of the BC Lions and the former Jesse Palmer with the Montreal Alouettes hold that distinction right now. And I think if Trey was going to be available to be drafted, I think he would be taken before that. But if he signs as a priority free agent with an NFL team, I think he will be what's called a futures pick for a Canadian Football League team. So where he goes this weekend, if he goes this weekend in the NFL draft, I think will dictate and determine whether or not where he's taken in the Canadian Football League draft.
The topic of debate around Canadian quarterbacks has been one that's been expansive for a long time. You mentioned the names of Jesse Palmer and Nathan Rourke, both going in the same position, maybe almost exactly a decade and change apart. Yep. Palmer was not able to have as much success in the CFL as maybe some would have hoped, and Rourke now has the keys to the car of the BC Lions, for figure of speech. Michael O'Connor is his backup, and there's been speculation that maybe the Lions will swing for Ford to create the first ever Canadian quarterback trio, which is something that we've never seen the likes of before. But there's a bit of a different outlook on the guys like Rourke and O'Connor, especially considering O'Connor dabbled a bit in Toronto, had a small bit of time there in Calgary last year, and now is in his third team in almost as many seasons. And the outlook on his ability to build an illustrious career is not as great as it once was. How do you assess the quarterback room for the BC Lions as far as it goes to the potential development of Nathan Rourke and a Michael O'Connor?
Well, I'll tell you right now, I have all the faith in the world in Nathan Rourke. I think he's got the mindset and he's got the mental toughness to be the face of a franchise. And I think he's a quality quarterback. He showed that at Ohio. He showed that last year in his two starts. He gave us an indication of the type of a quarterback he can be. And I think he is where he is based on talent, based on ability, and not so much based on his citizenship. The other, I'm waiting to find out what's going to happen with, and I'm having a brain cramp name, his backup. You mentioned it. Shoot.
O'Connor?
Yeah, Dan. I should remember O'Connor. I'm waiting to I'm waiting to see what we're going to see from O'Connor, because as you said, he's had a cup of coffee in Toronto. He had some brief time in Calgary, and now he's on his third team in as many seasons. But let's not forget, he went to Penn State originally in his college career, and that's quite an accomplishment for any quarterback, let alone a Canadian quarterback. Then he went to UBC and only led the school to a Vanier Cup. So his body of work is very encouraging, and I think he's where he is because of physical abilities as well. Now, if the Lions take Trey Ford, that would be very intriguing because, like you said, you'd have 3 Canadians vying for that number 1 job, and that would be unique. I don't think in my 30 plus years of covering the CFL, I've ever seen 2, let alone 3. And I think looking at Trey Ford, he'd be probably the most intriguing figure of the 3 because of his physical abilities, his stature, and also, the potential he might bring to a Canadian Football League team. So I'll be watching with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of interest to see where Trey goes. And if it's BC, that's going to be a fascinating story to follow.
The Canadian Football League has not seen the likes of strong talent at the pivot position, especially when it comes to homegrown talent in a long time. Russ Jackson being probably the holy grail of all Canadian quarterbacks ever. And you've been covering the CFL for quite a number of years now. Who would you say have been some of the best Canadian quarterbacks that the league has been able to produce in the time that you've been covering it?
Well, I was always intrigued to see how Larry Justanis could do, and he showed flashes of being a very, very good quarterback. And I wonder sometimes because of his citizenship if he did not get the same opportunity that an American would, in terms of being able to learn and graduate slowly into the Canadian Football League. The quarterback position has sort of been a hit or miss for Canadian quarterbacks. And in my mind, Russ Jackson was not only the holy grail of Canadian quarterbacks, but the greatest Canadian quarterback the CFL has seen and is the standard by which others are measured. So I think a guy like Trey Ford, if given the opportunity, could prove to be a good quarterback in the Canadian Football League who happens to be Canadian. And that's not the way we normally phrase it. We always phrase it as a Canadian quarterback in the CFL. And I think, to be fair, it would be nice to be able to call them a quarterback in the CFL who happens to be Canadian. But to me, the guy that I've always thought could do well was Larry Justanis. And I just wonder sometimes if politics got in the way of allowing him to develop. And, the atmosphere wasn't such for a team to be given the opportunity to allow him to develop, so where he could, make that step up from Canadian university to Canadian professional football.
Another name that comes to mind when you mention guys who step up from CIS at the time, or I guess CIAAU to the CFL, was Danny Brandigan, who was a 2-time Heck Crichton winner that wasn't really able to get his career off the ground, the Toronto Argonauts. And he was someone that I think people around the league were speculating might have had a solid chance to at least become a backup in the league. But it just seems so strange. Maybe the citizenship has to do with it. Maybe they just don't have it, or they're not playing up to the higher level of competition like guys like Brandon Bridge, or now we've seen, O'Rourke, come into the league like what they've been able to do in the CFL, Nathan Rourke and Brandon Bridge. Maybe Brandon Bridge wasn't as good, but they at least had the higher level of competition in college, having played in the US. Whereas guys who have come from university sport in Canada definitely haven't had as easy of a ride. Andrew Buckley is probably one of the prominent names that comes to mind with guys who had success. Mind you, that was in a smaller sample size. And then Michael O'Connor is still left in the battlefield. What do you remember of Danny Brandigan in terms of what opportunities you thought that he might have had to make a crack at the league?
Yeah, I remember Danny when he was with the Argos, and they gave him an opportunity to play in an exhibition game. I just think at the time it wasn't conducive to allowing a Canadian to give him the time to develop and to learn how to be a pro and to play the pro game and play at a pro level. Let's not forget, a lot of these coaches are American. A lot of these coaches are they have to win now. And for whatever reason, a lot of them don't think they can win with a Canadian quarterback. So they're a little less responsive to the idea of being able to give that quarterback the opportunity to grow, the opportunity to develop, and to, suffer the growing pains that come with starting a rookie quarterback, let alone a Canadian. You mentioned two names that I was, I should have mentioned too, and that was Buckley, who I thought was really had the opportunity to do very, very well, and then decided to step away from football to pursue a career outside of football, and good on him, for understanding that. Brandon Bridge to me was another one who I thought was the prototype to be a successful Canadian playing an American position, in that he was big, he had a strong arm, he could look downfield. But the other thing that Brandon brought is he was not afraid to tuck the ball under his arm and to take off, and he had the ability to scramble. He had some success in the CFL, and I do remember him leading the Saskatchewan Roughriders into the playoffs one year. But for whatever reason, like I said, I think it's because the coaches are American, and they'd rather hitch their wagon to what they know, and that would be an American quarterback, and who can develop quickly, and who's played football at a high level at the NCAA Division I level, and is able to step in and maybe win right away, whereas the Canadian guy hasn't quite developed to that point yet. And it really behooves the coach. They're in that they have that double-edged sword where they want to help grow, Canadian content, but the winning now is the realm of which coaches exist in, and they can't afford the luxury of spending 2 years to develop a Canadian quarterback, because they may not be around in the third year when this guy's about ready to step up and really contend for a starting job.
The topic of the ratio relates to this very heavily as well, because people recently have been talking about the idea of, well, if an American player has played in the CFL for 4 or 5 years, then they get national citizenship, which then ensures that they count towards the ratio. And then people have started to speculate and say, oh, well, if you get rid of the ratio, then there goes Canadian talents. But then some people say, oh, well, you're just being discriminatory to favor Canadians. But then people also bring up the angle of coaches. Like, how many Canadian coaches are there in a team? You mentioned American coaches hitching their wagon to what they know. How would that change if the offense coordinator was Canadian, or if the quarterback coach was Canadian, et cetera? There are all these Americans in the coaching staff. That also changes the perspective. What are your takes on the ratio as it currently stands, if you think that they should modify it, or if it should just be left the way it is?
Well, when you look at the Canadian Football League, to me, the first word is what stands out, and it's the Canadian Football League. And I'm a traditionalist, and I have no problem stating that. I'd like to see 7 Canadian starters remain. I'd like to see 20 plus Canadians on the roster. And I don't necessarily buy the argument that there's not enough Canadian talent to go around, because minor football in Canada, minor football in Ontario, which is what I know best, the numbers are going up in terms of registration, and I think more kids are playing the game, so that you're getting more of a grassroots involvement, so that everything rises up. You get more kids going to university, more kids getting exposed to university, and hence, there should be a good number of Canadians able to play Canadian football. I think the ratio should stay as it is. I have no qualms with 7 starters being Canadian. I have no qualms about 21 players on the roster being Canadian. It is the Canadian Football League. The C stands for something in my mind. And in the way I look at it, and I'm a traditionalist, I'll admit, and I know the league is not looking to try and appeal to people like me. They want to appeal to people like you, the younger generation. But to me, there are 3 things that are in my mind can't be touched, and that's the ratio, that's the size of the field, and that's 3 downs. Do what you want anywhere else, but you want to keep the integrity of Canadian football. I think those 3 elements have to remain intact.
the debates that they've had surrounding these topics have almost seemed a bit trivial in a way because, like you mentioned, those three elements are major cornerstones of what makes the Canadian Football League the Canadian Football League.
Mhm.
And a little bit before my time, as in, I guess, when I was born, you look back at the history of the Canadian Football League in the mid 90s when they were struggling financially and they were considering changing the rules and the ratio, and the American expansion brought to life all these sorts of questions that are continuing to resurface now. And the 94 Grey Cup was a great example of the North versus South. Are Canadians really worth keeping on the roster? And I think it's fair to say that the answer was in favor of Canadians, as Louis Pasaglia split the uprights at BC Place some 28 years ago. And it seems like it stood the test of time. I'm not sure if this is just hearsay or banter that they bring up every year to try to create more relevance around the league, because no press is bad press. But sometimes it seems a bit exhausting because even people like myself who enjoy the integrity of what makes it uniquely Canadian, it seems a bit annoying that every single year they continue to bring this up as if there's some looming major threat coming to the league, because it's not going to exist if we don't change to 4 downs, or if we don't make the field smaller, or if there's too many Canadians. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I'm in my mind, if we go back to US expansion, and this is, if you allow coaches the opportunity to reduce the number of Canadians on a roster, they will do so. And I go back to US expansion. You had teams, Canadian Football League teams based in the US that played by the rules that they didn't have to have Canadians on the roster. And none of the teams down south had Canadians on their roster. And the reason why is because there were an abundance of American players that they could pick from. They didn't have to bring Canadians down there, and they didn't. And the most successful coach in Canadian Football League at the time, Canadian Football League history, was Don Matthews. And when he went down to Baltimore, he had a completely American roster. Now, him and Jim Pop put together a team of Americans that could play the Canadian game. There's no doubt. They went to the Grey Cup in 94. They won it all in 95. They introduced us to Mike Pringle. They, who became the greatest running back that I've ever seen in Canadian Football League history. And they did the unmentionable. They ran the football, and they ran it very well, and they stuck to the running game. Whereas teams in Canada and coaches in Canada, it was, the pass happy, wide open Canadian football game. I just think if you give coaches the opportunity, they won't necessarily keep the Canadians on the roster, because there are more Americans. There's more of them down south, and they will come up and they will play the game. And I just think you keep the Canadian content the way it is, because, like I said, and I'm a traditionalist, the first word in the Canadian Football League is Canadian.
That was an interesting time when Don Matthews, who bounced around and leapfrogged from team to team to team, ran just an incredible offense that, being made entirely of Americans, was still able to find so much success. And like you mentioned, the name Mike Pringle, who is a legendary running back in the lore of the CFL. And they did win in 95, which still to this day is the only non-Canadian team to ever win the Grey Cup. But mind you, the next year it all fell apart. The American expansion discontinued, and Baltimore eventually ended up getting an NFL team, which destroyed any chances of American expansion continuing in the CFL, at least. But it begs a question. Is it that they think Canadians aren't as good as American players, or is it because they just want the convenience of people that they know more, like with more familiarity?
A little bit of both. I mean, coaches are creatures of habit, and American coaches and American GMs will tell you, I think, that they believe American players are better than Canadian players, and they cite that because the Canadian players play at the Canadian university level, and the American players play at Division I AA. Now we're seeing more and more Canadians going down south and excelling at the NCAA level. And I mean, this year, you know, John Mechie III and Jesse Lukita, two Canadians, are expected to be the first two Canadians taken in the NFL draft. Last year, there were 4 taken, which ties the all-time record. And, you know, there's been a resurgence of, well, maybe resurgence isn't the right word. There's been a surgence of Canadian talent excelling at the NCAA level. So I think it's showing that Canadians can play this game. You're seeing more and more Canadians going down to the U.S. to play high school to try and enhance their opportunities to get a football scholarship, but they're doing that. So I think Canadian players are showing that they can play the game of football, and I just think sometimes it's the coach's mindset. Coaches stick with what they know. Coaches are very much creatures of habit, and they will stick with the people they know rather than necessarily give what they don't know the opportunity, as I said, because their job is to win now. And if they have 2 players of equal talent, a guy that's played for me and I know, and a guy who hasn't played for me who I don't know and can't trust, they're going to go with the guy they can trust. And I don't think I'm jumping on a limb there. That's just the way coaches are. They have to win today to keep their jobs, and so they're going to stick with what they know. They're going to trust who they know, and that doesn't bode well for a new player, be him Canadian, be him American, be him global, whomever. Coaches are going to stick with what they know.
When you look at the coaches who have been Canadian versus American, would you say that makes a big difference in the talent that they can recognize in terms of football players north of the border? Because you say that they stick to what they know, and when you look at Canadian coaches like Wally Buono or Mike O'Shea, they seem to have had a little bit more success when it comes to winning championships, and maybe them understanding the depth of Canadian talent has something to do with it.
Yeah, maybe. I would think though, but those 2 guys that you mentioned, let's not forget they were former players and they won championships as, you know, they were players on winning championship teams, and they then graduated into the coaching ranks, and the lessons they learned, like I look at Wally, he played for Marv Levy, and he to this day has a very soft spot in his heart for the lessons that Marv Levy taught him as a player, taught him as a man, and taught him as a person. And I think Wally's been able to bring that to the coaching ranks. And I think Mike O'Shea is the same thing. He played for Don Matthews. He could tell you stories of Don Matthews, the coach, Don Matthews, the man off the field. And I think he's taken some of those lessons that he's learned from those guys like Adam Rita and Don Matthews and the like, and he's applied it to his coaching philosophies. But these 2 guys are very much, they're Canadians in the Canadian game. They understand the Canadian game. They've played the Canadian game. They've now coached the Canadian game. And in Winnipeg, you've got a Canadian GM to boot with Kyle Walters. So, you know, I just think the familiarity that they bring, both as all 3 as players, and what they bring to their present job, I think enhances and allows them to do their present jobs even better.
Who would you then rank, in your opinion, as the top 3 or top 5 best Canadian coaches in CFL history, at least from the time that you've covered the league, and even if you have strong opinions on ones that you watched growing up as a kid before you started covering it?
Yeah. Well, I think Wally would be number 1 far and away, based on what he's accomplished and what he accomplished as both a player and as a coach. I think Mike O'Shea is on that way. He's on that path. A guy who I thought was a very, very good coordinator and a very, very good coach was Greg Marshall in Hamilton. We only saw him for a year and a bit. And, you know, I mean, to me, the man as a coach was phenomenal. He's shown that both at MAC and at Western Ontario. I don't think there's any question of questioning the football acumen of a Greg Marshall. And I think he should be mentioned too. He didn't spend a whole lot of time as a head coach in the CFL, but his, what he's done in the game speaks for itself. I've also liked what Marcel Belfay did when he was both in Hamilton and as a coordinator and as a head coach. These are Canadian guys too that have gone on, and Marcel has done very, very well at the University of Ottawa, and gone on to coach outside of the CFL as well. So, there's a few of them. I like. I'm having another brain cramp. Defensive coordinator in Ottawa.
Mike Benavides.
Yes, thank you. And what Mike did in with Wally, one was part of Grey Cup winning staffs, and I think he's another Canadian coach too who has done exceedingly well, and is somebody that he could be on the upper echelon to be a head coach again if he chose to, and so I mean there are Canadian coaches, there's no doubt. Jim Daly was another one in Saskatchewan who, guided the Riders to a Grey Cup appearance and was a longtime assistant and did very, very well in the coaching ranks, held a number of positions. So yeah, there are Canadian coaches who've excelled and done well. I think Stefan Potasic is another one who did very, very well as a coordinator. And then, was more comfortable maybe at the college game, and what he's done at Mac is nothing short of fabulous and fantastic. And he's another young Canadian coach who I thought had a bright future in the CFL if he wanted it. And there's nothing wrong if they want to go back and coach at the university ranks and develop kids and develop players for the CFL. I think that's invaluable as well. So yeah, there's a number of Canadian coaches who I think do very, very well. UBC, Greg, oh shoot. I'm having another brain camp. Blake Nill at UBC is another guy who I'm surprised has not gone on to be a head coach in the Canadian Football League. Another guy who does very, very well at the university ranks. And of course, the Mr. Constantine and Laval, to me, if Glenn's a perfect example in my mind that if he was the head coach at Florida State, Florida, Ohio State, and did the things there that he's done in Canada at Laval, he would be earmarked for a head coaching gig, making millions in the National Football League. And yet he's a guy who we don't talk a whole lot about as a potential head coach in the Canadian Football League. And that's unfortunate because I think guys like Blake, guys like Constantine, guys like Potasic, Marcel Belfay, again, who, if they haven't been a head coach at this late, they've only had the job for a few years, Greg Marshall included. I think these are guys that could and would do very, very well in the long term in Canadian football, but for whatever reason, they're not given that opportunity, or they choose not to.
I think also maybe job security might play a factor in this because you look at what Glenn Constantin has done. Is there really anything that's incentivizing him to go to the CFL? How much more is he going to make there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You would probably have to give him to entice him. You'd have to guarantee him 5 years and pay a lot of money. I don't know. And I mean, why would those guys leave those positions where, they're in charge, it's their program, and they have built-in success. That's a valid point. But I look at a guy like Wally Buono who every year when he first started out, had to prove himself and had to win that first Grey Cup. He had to lead the Stampeders to success. It can be done if they so choose, and if they're given the opportunity. Because I remember Wally being given the opportunity by Norman Kwong, and Normie also understood that a young coach was going to have to be given the reins a bit and was going to have to learn how to fail before he could succeed. And so maybe that's it. Maybe it has to be the best possible opportunity for them, and that possibility doesn't exist. But I thought Greg Marshall, being the head coach in Hamilton, I thought that was tailor-made for him to do well, and he did decently the first year. And but you know what, the win now mentality in pro football, the next year, unfortunately, he was gone.
And I think that also puts a bit of a taint on some people who have had the opportunity to be head coaches in the NFL. Like you said, Mark Trestman has been a genius of the game for a long time. And in Chicago, he was given a relatively short leash, mind you, because they expect you to win relatively quickly. If you don't, then you're going to be out the door. And the reputation that you build in those first few years as a head coach in the NFL will probably determine your fate to continue to do that till the end of time. Because if you don't do well as a head coach, then, or you're not in the club, then that's it. They'll cast you away. Maybe you can scrap up a coordinator or positional coaching gig and then work from there. But I think Mark Trestman is someone who has maybe given a bit of the short end of the stick, but nonetheless, it doesn't take away from the amazing legacy he built being a head coach and also coordinator before in the NFL, but mainly as a head coach in the CFL.
Yeah, true. I mean, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Mark as a football mind and as a head coach. I mean, he showed up here what he could do, with the Canadian game. And but I mean, I think he'd be the first to tell you, you are in the NFL, you are hired to be fired. And it's easier to fire a head coach and his staff than it is to cut $1 million quarterback or $1 million running back. Or, the players know in the NFL that chances are they're going to be around a lot longer than the head coach. So it's a different animal in the National Football League as opposed to university, where you have control of a player. And at the NFL level, at the pro level, you don't have that control. You don't have that sway or that cachet that a lot of them do at the college ranks. So, I mean, like I said, the NFL is a whole different animal when you're talking about head coaches.
And you did mention some names that you would like to have seen get a longer chance or actually go up to the CFL. Yeah. But I'm not sure if we'll ever see those coaches head to the CFL, and we just have to look towards the next generation. I mean, mind you, there are some people who used to play in the CFL. Scott Flory, probably one of the biggest examples of a head coach that has had success in university sport, as well as a player, an offensive lineman with the Montreal Alouettes. I think Chris Morris as well had a lot of success playing as a professional football player and has had a lot of success building up the Golden Bears program at University of Alberta. They struggled for many years and now are seen as a legitimate force to be reckoned with in the Canada West. Are there any other head coaches that you see as prospective people who may get a chance to go to the CFL later on in their career?
Well, I mean, you touched upon the two that I would probably bring to the fore. I look at a guy like Brian Dobie in Manitoba, who's been there forever. Here's another guy that's had success and maybe would be someone who might be deserving as a coordinator or as a head coach in the CFL. But again, I think you brought up a valid point. Why would you give up the relative security of a college job as opposed to the the volatility of a pro job? And it's win now. And if you can't win now, then you're not going to be in the head job for very, very long. At the Canadian college level, you do get that little bit of grace. Everything seems to be cyclical, where you can recruit, and in the space of a couple of years, maybe that recruiting class in 2 years will start to pay dividends for you. You don't have that luxury at the pro level. You got to win immediately, and you got to win now. And if you don't, then the NFL, not for long. That's what it stands for. So I mean, that's what happens in Canadian pro football as well. If you don't win, you're not in that job for very long.
In your time having covered football for many years with the Canadian press, you've also been able to cover horse races. Have you had the opportunity to cover as well university sport, or is it mainly revolved around CFL?
I've done some Vanier Cups. I've done some back when it was CIAU hockey. The Final Four tournament used to be held in Toronto. Vanier Cups when they were in Southern Ontario. One of the best games I've ever seen was the Vanier Cup between Laval and Mac Batassi when Mac won in overtime, and that was in Vancouver. And I remember watching that game, and being very thankful I didn't have to write it. So, but no, yeah, I've had the opportunity to watch some Yates Cups, some Vanier Cups, some CI. I guess it's U Sports now, U Sports hockey, and yeah, it's very, very entertaining, very, very competitive sport, and we don't give it enough credit.
So as someone as well who has covered the Grey Cup and has covered a lot of Canadian Football League games, there's been a debate that has gone on for a long time about craziest Grey Cups, most entertaining games. So I need to know, in your opinion, what would you say are the top 3 Grey Cups that were the craziest, most entertaining games in order? Because there's a few that come to my mind, but you would have at least lived through more of them than I would.
I remember the '89 Grey Cup at Sky Dome, now Rogers Center, Hamilton and Saskatchewan. Tony Champion with broken ribs, making the best individual play I think I've ever seen in a Grey Cup. I remember the '76 Grey Cup, Ottawa and Saskatchewan, when Tommy Clements hit Tony Gabriel with the winning touchdown. Everybody in the world knew that that play was coming, and yet it still happened. I remember, the Ottawa Calgary Grey Cup that went to overtime. Henry Burris and leading the Red Blacks to their first Grey Cup in 40 years. That ranks up there. Andrew Harris in 219 putting on probably the best, most dominant individual performance I've ever seen in a Grey Cup, and helping Winnipeg win its first Grey Cup since 1990 from then. So, I mean, in order, I'll be honest, I'm not sure I could. I could name them off the top of my head, but in order, I can't really think of one that stands out as the most exciting, because they're all exciting. A lot of them are exciting. I just remember the stories behind a lot of them, but I remember '76 was very big to me. I remember 1989 was big to me, with the win there, and I would think the Ottawa's first Grey Cup in overtime against Calgary, ending it was a 40-year drought for the city of Ottawa. I think those are the 3 that come to mind. But like I said, if you want to talk about the most compelling individual performance I've ever seen, that would be Andrew Harris in 219.
That game was something out of this world, especially for Winnipeg fans who had waited a long, long time. I know when I was at the game in person watching with my friends, and we had never seen Winnipeg win the Grey Cup in our entire lifetimes. And we were there to witness it, and it almost seemed like something out of a storybook, because they had been multiple times since they last won, losing every time, usually in crushing fashion or some heartbreaking story. And them being, each team has their own triumphant win from a crazy drought. Even Toronto, who have won more Grey Cups than anyone. You mentioned Ottawa's. As someone like yourself who grew up as a diehard Rough Riders fan, I can only imagine what it would have felt like seeing Ottawa win, even though you're covering it, you're professional, but just knowing that little kid inside of you way back in the day, watching Tony Gabriel's touchdown, to fast forwarding to Ernest Jackson, giving the entire city of Ottawa 28 heart attacks in the span of 5 seconds while he bobbles the ball and finally reels it in. That must have been also a super crazy feeling for Ottawa football fans.
I would imagine it was, but I'll be honest with you, I stopped being an Ottawa football fan when the Riders died. They were the team that I followed as a kid. They were the team that was my favorite team. And when the Riders died in the '90s, my fandom died too. I mean, I was happy, like you said, I was happy for the city of Ottawa. It made for a great story to write. I mean, Henry Burris ultimately retired after that. The drama of the overtime catch, like you said, Jackson he held on, and the 40 years for Ottawa. Yeah, I mean, but every one of them has their own story. Like you said, 219, Winnipeg ending the drought. 2021, Winnipeg winning back to back, and doing so in both games, doing so quite in, well, I shouldn't say emphatically. Overtime is not really emphatic, but exciting games, and putting their stamp on as the model franchise in the Canadian Football League in the last 3 years. So I mean, yeah, they all have their stories, and they all they all, I don't want to say they write themselves, but they all have the background stories to them.
So then your fandom died with the Rough Riders in
Yes.
'96.
Yes.
So I need to know then, because there are so many stories that have swirled around Ottawa football, especially as far as it pertains to the CFL, with them not having a winning season from 81 to 96 to coming back as the Renegades,
Mm-hmm.
the Gleiberman's ownership, which is a novel in and of itself, to the Red Blacks finally resuscitating Ottawa professional football for the third time. What was it about Ottawa that made you feel like the Red Blacks, or sorry, not the Red Blacks, but the Force Abbott, the Rough Riders, that was so captivating for you as a kid? And what was it about their ending that was so tragic? Because they were a storied franchise, just like the Toronto Argonauts.
That iconic R on the helmet. I remember the very first game. I started watching Canadian football in 1972 with my dad, who was a diehard Ticats and remains a diehard Ticats fan. And every time Ottawa would play Hamilton, they would win. And I've told Tony Gabriel this. I hated him when he played for the Ticats. I hated him because he won Grey Cups with the Ticats, and they would invariably beat Ottawa. But then when he went to the Riders, it's like, oh, good, they have this guy. I'll start liking him. And then when he won, when he got the game-winning touchdown, like, all was forgiven because he helped the Riders win a Grey Cup. So you know what, that iconic R, and Ken Verrera and I have this conversation a lot. He played with them in the latter parts of the franchise's history. Being an Ottawa kid playing for the Rough Riders was a big thrill for him. But when I see the picture of him wearing that R, and that iconic R on the side of his helmet, I just feel very nostalgic. It really, I mean, the very first, I remember watching a guy like Rome Nixon, a receiver, to me was the epitome of cool, because he just seemed to flow. And then Rick Casada as a quarterback, same deal, and they were always in the hunt for a Grey Cup. And then in '76 they finally did. So like I said, it was a great time to be a Rough Rider, an Ottawa Rough Riders fan, because they were always in the thick of it.
And I think it was it the '82 Grey Cup that they didn't have
81.
a winning season, but they
81.
ended up, that was the final of the 5.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. 1980. Yeah. 1981.
81. That was.
Yeah. And J.C. Watts, that was his rookie year. They were 5-11, and they played that Edmonton juggernaut, and almost they came so close to registering the greatest upset in Grey Cup history. And as it was, they were up 20-1 at the half. That was my very first Grey Cup game attending, and I watched it in the auxiliary press box at the Big O, and it was fabulous, and then heartbreaking at the very end.
So then I gotta ask you, those first few years then covering the Grey Cup, what was it like dealing with the innate fandom that you had as a kid versus like now you're a professional and you're covering this, and you're not going to cheer for Ottawa to win.
No. You know what? I can honestly say by the time I started doing this professionally, I become football fan without portfolio. I don't cheer for a team. I don't cheer for anything. I'm very much interested in seeing a great game I'm very much interested in trying to tell the story of whatever game I'm championship game I'm covering. But I mean, and I like to see great things happen to good people. So I mean, when Winnipeg wins back-to-back Grey Cups, I'm happy for Mike O'Shea. I'm happy for Zach Collaros. I'm happy for Andrew Harris. I'm happy for Kyle Walters. When the Argos would win their Grey Cups, I'm happy for Chris Van Zyl. I'm happy for Noel Prefontaine. I'm happy for Ricky Ray. You know, when Ottawa won its Grey Cup, I'm happy for Henry Burris. I'm happy for, you know, the players and good people. You want to see good things happen. You know, I'm happy for Rick Campbell, who I think, you know, I think the world of as a coach. So that's where I'm at this point. When I started doing this professionally, the fandom goes out the window. I love football. I don't particularly love a particular team. I love watching. I mean, I love watching a great game, be it high school, be it college, be it pro, you know, be it a touch game, you know, between two elementary schools, what have you. I just love watching football played well is good enough for me, and seeing good people and happy, you know, being happy for quality people to succeed. That's where I get my satisfaction.
That's as satisfying a feeling as any, because you know that as a professional, you're not really also supposed to cheer for anyone because you're covering it, and that's your job as a reporter.
Well, I mean, and yet by the same token too, this is where you feel heartbroken too. Like, I mean, I want to see Orlando Steinauer succeed, and to see him come so close twice. I mean, and that's gut wrenching, because you see a quality person, and you see a guy who gets it, and you see a guy who, you know, puts in the work, and to come so close and to be turned away, while you're happy for O'Shea and all the guys that I listed, you know, you really feel bad for the other people who are that close, you know, and that, you know, and then I get more respect when I talk to Orlando since, and he still has that drive and that passion to do the grind, to do what it takes to get to the next level and to win that. And you know what? Kudos to him, because I mean, some people, it's, you know, you get kicked in the gut enough times, you just stay down. He goes, no, they get right back up, they brush themselves off, and they go right back to work. And I admire that.
100%. And it is so tough to see great quality people not be able to, like, just be so close. They're almost there, but they just don't get it. And once they do, that is a satisfying feeling in and of itself, because you know the transformation, you know what they had to go through and the dues they had to pay to finally get to the top of the mountain. And I think that is what creates great stories and makes for amazing storytelling when you're doing your job. Yeah.
I mean, Jeremiah Mazzoli is another one. Here's a guy, you know, was having a great year, and then, you know, had a knee injury, and then Dane Evans came on and led them to a Grey Cup. And then we have no football in 2020, and in 2021, Jeremiah comes back and, you know, gets them to the Grey Cup. And then Evans comes on, you know, comes on in the East Final and leads them to the Grey Cup again. And you know, you look, and I mean, Jeremiah, I have a ton of time for Jeremiah Mazzoli, and a ton of admiration for his ability. And there's another person that, you know, you want to see good things happen for. And it's gut wrenching when you have to go and talk to them after, and you know that they're hurting inside, and you got to ask those really pertinent questions. And I have a lot of admiration for the guys that stand up, and you know what, they answer them, and they answer them honestly, and they answer them truthfully. And then, you know, I mean, I have a ton of time. I hope Jeremiah does exceedingly well in Ottawa, and because another guy, you know, good people, you want to see great things happen for good people.
I couldn't agree more. It's one of the best things about the job of being a reporter, is being able to see those good stories, and then just it's endless. But even if there's 9 teams or 20 teams or 2 teams or 100 teams, there's always great stories abound. And especially when it comes to Canadian Football League, I don't think there's any shortage of the storylines, especially the ones that are heading into this season, like you mentioned, with some of the people who have changed teams. seeing Jeremiah Masoli and what he does in Ottawa will definitely be one that Canadian football fans in general, I think, should pay close attention to, regardless of who they cheer for, because he's an outstanding competitor.
Agreed. But you're right. There's stories like that all across the league. Excuse me. We talked about Nathan Rourke in BC. We've got Bo Levi Mitchell coming back from injury, and you've got Cody Fajardo in Saskatchewan, trying to get that team over the hump. You've got Zach Caleros trying to go for a third Grey Cup. You've got, can McLeod Bethel Thompson lead the Argos to a Grey Cup appearance? Can Dane Evans, as the starter in Hamilton, be the guy to take them to a Grey Cup? Vernon Adams Jr. in Montreal, can he build on a promising season from last year and get the Alouettes into the play, into the East Final, into a Grey Cup? I mean, there's stories like that all across the league. And I just took the quarterbacks, but you could put them. You got other position players that applies to as well.
Dan, we're getting towards the end of our time on today's episode, so I want to ask you
appreciate it.
Wrap-up questions before and have a little more fun before we part for today.
Okay.
My first question for you is, what was the most difficult Grey Cup game that you had to cover for Canadian Press?
The first time the game went into overtime. Montreal, I remember Danny Machocha celebrating and prematurely, and then the game, was in overtime. And anytime a Grey Cup goes into overtime, it's a stressful time as a reporter, because everything that you wrote up into the first, this year, when the game goes into overtime, that 350 words that I wrote about the first half, well, I just do a very quick alt and delete, because what happened in the first half means nothing. And now you're writing in real time. And you take a deep breath. I mumble a couple words to myself, and then that becomes that. When it goes to overtime, it becomes stressful. It becomes very stressful.
Best quarterback to have not won a Grey Cup in CFL history, or at least from the time you started covering the league, to make it narrow down a little more.
I'll go with Jeremiah. I'll go
Jeremiah?
I'll go with Masoli. Yeah. I mean, I remember when he was I would have said Zach, because he was having a really good season before he suffered the knee injury, but he's won too. But I would say Jeremiah Masoli, probably, in my mind, right off the top of my head. I would stick with that.
Who would you say was the most talented player as a running back in the time that you've covered the Canadian Football League?
Mike Pringle. Not even close.
Who would you rather have to build a receiving core around? Giroy Simon or Milt Stegall?
Damn it.
To build around.
I either or, but if I had to make a choice, I would probably say Giroy. Only because I really like the Superman pose after those touchdowns.
Who do you think is the best head coach in the Canadian Football League in the last 10 years?
Two of them, and the two that I mentioned, I would say Don Matthews and Wally.
Who is the best team that lost the Grey Cup in the time you've covered the league?
Baltimore Stallions.
94?
Yeah.
And my final question is, if you had the chance to interview one player that you've never had the chance to interview before, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Probably. And I'm trying to remember if I would say Jackie Parker, only because I think Jackie Parker, during his time with the Edmonton then Eskimos, was the closest thing that I would say to Doug Flutie. And to me, Doug Flutie is the best player I have ever seen play in the Canadian Football League in my time up here. And I would think Jackie would be on par with that. I think Jackie Parker in his heyday was the Doug Flutie of his era.
And there we have it. Dan, I want to thank you for having been on today's episode. It was great chatting Canadian football with you, and I really enjoyed getting your insight on your time having covered the league for many years, Canadian quarterbacking, head coaches, and the importance of tradition in the Canadian Football League.
Well, I appreciate it. I want to know where the time went, because I thought we just got started, but okay.
So thank you to the listener for enjoying today's episode with Canadian Press reporter, editor, and Canadian Football Hall of Fame member, Dan Ralph.